Welcome to the Eat, Train, Prosper podcast, where we provide you sustainable training principles for strength and building muscle, effective nutrition practices for improving and maintaining a lean physique, and practical lifestyle habits for becoming a champion of your own health, both inside and out. Hosted by Aaron Straker and Brian Borstein. Welcome to episode 3 of the Eat, Train, Prosper podcast. Today, Brian and I are talking about some tips and tricks that we've kind of discovered over our lifting careers that improve kind of exercise execution and performance of specific exercises within the context of what you are performing them for. So an example would be for hypertrophy versus like power or output for strength. So Brian, how has the last couple days been going for you since the new year hit?
Everything's good, man. Training's going well. I'm reaching a point where I'm training just as hard with just as many sets, and I'm just not really getting sore anymore. So I think that that's an interesting development and probably speaks to a few different things, potentially the need for a deload as well. So, more updates to come on that. I think my next cycle here after deload is going to be a specialization phase of sorts, with priority on hamstrings and maybe some quads. I'm not sure. I got to talk to my coach, but everything's going well. I got my hack press leg machine fixed. It was user error. I thought it was the fault of the machine. And after many back and forth emails, I took the machine apart, put it back together, realized that I inserted a attachment piece and tightened it when they specifically said do not tighten until the end. Never had an issue with that before, but now I understand why you are not supposed to tighten things until the end.
Yeah, it's always kind of funny when you figure that out,
Yep.
and at the end of the day, it's
How
super
about
good.
you?
So for me, last 7 days have been pretty good. You know, scheduling into the new year, I'm wrapping up a launch, so that's always really busy time. Jenny and I got away for a couple days to celebrate some accomplishments in 2020, so that was pretty cool, just to like tap out for like 2 days and walk around, eat some seafood, which was really, really cool. But I'm excited now just to get back into my routine. I really thrive on routine, so I really like it. Training's going really well. I'm now 2 weeks into I'm on a leg specialization, so training legs 3 times per week. And I was really pleasantly surprised around that third day. Going into the third day last week, I had a little bit of soreness still in like my VMO, but after the training session, just getting like so much blood in there, I felt better after than when I went in. So that's always kind of an interesting perspective how that can happen. And then I just crushed like a shit ton of rice the rest of the day, as we were walking around and outside a lot and sweating a lot. So that really helped. And then I have tomorrow will be that third day again. And I feel my legs already feel pretty good. So I'm excited about that. Training's going well.
Sweet. And oh, sorry, continue.
Yeah, training's going well. And I'm just, ready for the new year, ready to get back to work and keep hammering.
Nice. And then one of the things that you got to do during your little getaway trip to, was it Isle Mujeres? Is that what it
Isla
was?
Mujeres. Yeah.
Isla Mujeres. You got to use that super dope leverage squat machine that you love that lets you hammer your quads so well. So why is that machine so good for you?
Oh, so it's like perfect for this conversation we're gonna have on the podcast.
Yep.
It just fits my like leverages or my levers, I should say, which is interesting because it's called the lever squat, like perfectly. So the amount of the angle that the foot plate is in allows me to get in like a full, ankle dorsiflexion position without it being like too much, like some of the old school hack squats where it will like limit your range of motion. The way that the machine kind of goes over your like traps onto your back allows you to really like lean back into it, which removes that like balancing portion, right? You can just, and you
Hmm.
can go, it's kind of like a swing angle, So you get super deep. I can keep my entire foot flat on the pad perfectly fine without any weird positioning. And it's just like a really good resistance pattern through the entire curve. So it's really, challenging in the bottom, and it's still really challenging like 70-80% of the concentric portion of the movement. So it's great on my joints. Everything about it I love. So I was super pumped to find it in this little like hole in the wall gym on an island. And we're going to head down to Tulum in like the last weekend of the month. We have a couple really big work weekends we can't do anything for. and I already found one there too. And it's like same thing, another little hole in the wall gym. And I guess it's like one of the things that they just put in the gyms here when people create gyms, which is very cool.
Very cool. Do you feel like it's similar to a pendulum squat machine?
It is very, very similar. It's a little bit more, the pendulum squat kind of pushes you more back. So that like, as opposed to like up. So the curve is a little
Yeah.
bit different. The pendulum squat requires a more equipment space. It's a little bit longer. This one is a little bit more compact, but it's a very, very similar stimulus, but not quite 100% as like the pendulum.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, that's awesome. I obviously started looking at leverage squat machines after you sent me that,
Yeah.
and I found a few for under $1,000. So maybe I'll try and like finagle my gym and create another spot for a new machine.
Yeah, I remember saying, I was like, man, this one's like because when we were talking about the pendulum squat, it's like a few $1,000s, and this one I was like, it's almost the same thing. It's not that big. It's like seems kind of reasonable to have in a home gym, and I wanted to see what the price was. And I'm like, yeah, it's arguably a pretty decent deal.
The size is really a huge factor too. Like the hack press machine I have is compact, and a pendulum squat is huge, but this thing sits more vertically. So I think that there is a possibility that it could fit at some point.
Yeah. What's really cool is that's going to kind of lead us right into our first kind of body part that we were talking about with this episode today. So, Bryan, tell us a little bit more about like quadriceps and then any kind of specific movement patterns you really like for it or movements that you like to target your quads. I think what's important to provide with the context of this podcast is we are talking primarily about hypertrophy, unless we will kind of say for a strength pattern or like a power output pattern. But in terms of the majority of this conversation will be in regards to hypertrophy.
For sure, yeah. And then with the context of hypertrophy, I think Dr. Israel's stimulus to fatigue ratio is an important thing to keep in mind because that is something that I think is intuitive for most people that focus on physique, in that you kind of just know that you're not supposed to choose movements that destroy your body, and you know that you're supposed to pay a little bit more attention to the way that your muscles are feeling through the movement. So I think even intuitively, if you don't have a stimulus fatigue ratio specifically, you make decisions in your programming, or you should be making decisions in your programming partially based off of movements that are providing a stimulus to the target muscle and not to the muscles that you're not targeting, kind of just wasting energy at that point or recovery resources. So kind of with that in mind, any squat pattern movement is going to involve both knee extension and hip extension. So think about when you sit down into a squat, your knees bend, and then you're also folding over slightly at the torso, and your hips going to bend as well. Even if you maintain a perfectly erect torso position, it still changes your hip angle. So that's important to keep in mind here, that when you squat, you cannot avoid the combination of both hip extension and knee extension. The degree by which a movement prioritizes the quads is going to be how much the movement biases knee extension versus hip extension. So if you can picture in your mind what a low bar squat would look like in general format when practiced, by powerlifters, you see them kind of fold in half at the hip and really create as minimal knee extension as necessary to get them to parallel, which is the requirement for them to then turn around and come back up and call it a good rep. In that type of squat, they're purposefully trying to take the quad out of the movement because the quad is significantly weaker than the force that your glutes and your erectors can put into the movement. So in turn, a bodybuilder or a physique athlete would want to do the exact opposite of that. What they would want to do is take this movement and bias it for the quad, because this then requires you to use less weight, which in turn means that you can get more stimulus to the quad with less debt caused into recovery. So as kind of like a basic background context, that's what we're looking at when we're talking about quad hypertrophy specifically. The ways that we can kind of go to increase knee flexion and decrease hip extension is, number one, elevating the heels. So this in itself is not magic. You can still mess a squat up and lean too far forward at the torso. What the heel elevation does is it increases the ability of your ankles to flex forward to create ankle dorsiflexion. This then allows the quad to stretch. However, I've seen this butchered so many times, right? So there's something that happens when you descend down into a squat if the priority is quads. And it's not just a matter of taking the rep from top position to the bottom of the squat and then coming back up again. You actively want to try and feel your quad stretching as you descend. This requires you to do it in a very controlled manner. You're not just dropping your butt down. You're actively trying to send the knees forward so that as the knees drive forward over the toes, you feel this immense stretch occur in your quad. And when you get to the bottom of the movement, you're not just sitting there with no tension just to be like, okay, I hit the bottom of the movement, let's turn around and come back up. You're actively feeling that stretch engage so deep in the bottom of that squat that when you change direction and turn back around, the quad is just like ripping in pain. And this takes practice over many years to be able to get this feeling of building this tension in your quad as you descend, to feel it increasing, that's stretching deeper and deeper. So kind of to kick this back to you real quick, and then I have more to say on the quad topic, but talk a little bit about kind of your experience with this positioning and the things that have helped you.
Yeah, so for me, it's been basically goal driven, right? So I kind of had gotten to this point through just, lifting and, my career, I guess, in the weight room where I'd become like very, very top heavy. So the amount of muscle that I had on my upper body like was orders of magnitude more than my lower body. And I had always, at some point in my lifting career when I was younger, I'd bought into that kind of ego thing. It was like, all you need is heavy squats, like squat heavy often, and that's what you need. So I did that a lot. But I think it's really interesting because I'm sure you've kind of felt that same way. We have similar levers in body sizes. Like I'm not built to squat very well. Very, very long femur. And even though I have a good ankle dorsiflexion, my back is so much stronger than my quads, it would always take over. So when I'd hit the bottom of that squat, the first thing that would happen is my hips would shift back, put me in a more mechanically advantageous position for me to move like a free weight. So even though I did all get stronger, you know what I mean? But my legs would never really grow. And then whenever we do like higher reps, my back would get smoked and my glutes would be on fire, but I'd never have that feeling of like a stimulus in my quads. Like my legs would never get that pump because I just wasn't putting myself in a good position for that to occur. So as I kind of like moved in and really got serious about my, quad goals, I kind of left that ego of okay, all I need to do is squat heavy because I did that for years and I never really produced any kind of fruits of the labor from it, and moved into more of like a bodybuilding style. So I would start, using like the leg press or the Smith machine squat. So I could put myself in a position where my back would be kind of rigid. So I couldn't, overpower the movement with my back because the machine or whatever will hold you in that position. And that's when things really started to change. And I quickly found out like how, untrained, I guess, to a certain degree my quads were, because they would just like tap out really, really fast, or that buildup of that burning feeling would really kind of hit quickly, and it was just. But at the same time, they were finally starting to grow. So I think what was really, really important was finding positions that allowed me to like get to that full range of motion in a position where my knees felt really safe and comfortable, and I wasn't like letting the machine, put me in a weird spot where I was putting like a twisting kind of force on my knee or anything like that, and just moving through a full range of motion, keeping my foot completely flat, whether that's on the ground, the plate on the leg press, or the hack squat or something like that. And then things really, really started to change by, using equipment that would kind of force me to not let my back overpower the movement and let my legs and quads do the work. And it's been, it sucks, they're hard. Those days are really, really hard, pushing quads for heavier or higher reps, but the stimulus is there. I'm getting like that really, really good quad pump and hamstring pump in the target muscles. And I'm finally, starting to produce returns on that process.
Cool. Very cool. I think the biggest kind of response I get from people, at least people, that aren't experienced with this type of squat, tends to be that, oh, well, if your knees are going that far forward, isn't this going to be really bad on your knees? And I think that the first thing to say is that if you have knee problems, you probably want to get those fixed before you put your knees in this position. But after that, I think that once you figure out how to load the muscle through that position and not the joint, that it really is, it's no worse for you than squatting any other way. And in fact, I would say that the fact that you learn how to load the muscle is going to benefit your knees in the long term, because you've finally figured out how to take that stress off the joints and put it into the muscles. And being able to feel a muscle stretch and lengthen as you lower is really the first step. So people always, they rush the eccentric always, whether it's squats or bench press or any movement, people rush the eccentric and then they just try to get the weight back up. But if you just drop the weight and you don't actually build tension in the muscle as you're lowering the weight down, then it's putting a lot of that tension onto the joint and causing stress there, versus loading the muscle, where the muscle can then change direction, use that stretch, and come back up with tons and tons of tension. So one little caveat there, but an additional topic kind of regarding quad training is single leg movements. And there's definitely a very obvious and easy way to bias the glute or the quad in single leg movements. So the first, I think, is super simple in that if you want the quad, you create ankle dorsiflexion. So your knee goes forward. It's very much emulating the exact same position that we were talking about in the squat or the squat machines or anything like that, where the knee gets sent super far forward over the toes. Another thing that helps that is a slightly shorter stance. So when you're doing a single leg movement, if you're a little bit shorter, it allows you to leverage over the knee a little bit more effectively. In contrast, if you're looking for more of a glute specific single leg movement, then you want to make sure that that front shin is going to be vertical. So keep that knee stacked over the ankle. Don't let any ankle dorsiflexion occur. Make sure that all of your pressure is pushing through the heel and specifically the outside of the heel that aligns directly with the outside of the glute. Your stance should be a bit wider, or longer rather, wider and maybe definitely longer, possibly wider. Because the point of the movement is to stretch the glute at the bottom. It is the complete antithesis of what we're trying to do when we're doing quad work, right? So at the bottom of the rep, instead of thinking about sending the knee forward and feeling the deep stretch in the quad, we want to send the torso forward and feel a deep stretch in the glute. And then when we push back up out of the bottom, the tension is coming through the heel, which is going to drive directly into the glute. So just kind of some interesting tidbits there. And then final thoughts here on quad movements is a lot. Let me backtrack. When shelter in place started in March, when all this COVID stuff hit, one of the biggest problems that physique athletes were having is how do we hit the quad specifically in absence of hip extension? So this is going back to the beginning of our discussion about how every time you squat, there is hip extension and knee extension. How do we create knee extension without hip extension? In a gym, it's really easy because we have a leg extension machine. We just bend at the knee, we flex, we bend, we flex, and the quad gets worked. The reason this is necessary, like why can't we just squat all the time, right? Because squats do work all portions of the quad. The difference is that a isolation quad movement where you're creating knee extension without hip extension is going to better target the rectus femoris. A movement that extends the hip and the knee together, it spans both joints and it won't allow as much specific rectus femoris focus. So when quarantine started here, everyone was struggling to figure out ways that they could train isolation style quad movements. And we found 5 pretty solid variations. There's a banded leg extension. So you'll just be sitting on a bench with a band connected under the bench, and you can do leg extensions this way. Bands have their drawbacks, so that isn't my favorite movement. Mostly that there's no tension at the bottom of the movement, or that it decreases tension significantly at the bottom of the movement. There's an inverted leg extension. This is actually a pretty cool movement where you're almost in a plank position with your feet elevated on a riser, like a bench, and you're creating a leg extension movement like that. You can totally Google that to get an image there, and then you can add bands to that and make it harder. A dumbbell leg extension, not my favorite movement. I think it's really awkward to get into the dumbbell and secure it on your feet. And I feel like you spend as much time bracing and trying to hold that dumbbell in steady position as you are trying to actually move your legs. And I think that it just creates a pretty shitty stimulus to fatigue ratio. The body weight leg extension, or the reverse Nordic, was my jam at the beginning of quarantine here. If you haven't seen this movement, you essentially start kneeling on the ground with your torso completely straight up and down, and you lean back with the objective of trying to stretch the quad and get your butt to touch your heels. The caveat there is that your torso has to remain in a completely straight line with your hip, or with your legs, creating a completely straight and open hip angle. These are significantly harder than you think, so they can be assisted with bands and with a pole, or with using your hand. You can use your hand to kind of hold a wall or something like that and kind of provide assistance there. The band assistance is probably my favorite, so you can Google all these things too. And then finally, the sissy squat variations are really legit. So these kind of create the exact same idea, but you're starting standing, you get onto your toes, and then you try to drive your knees toward the ground. This it has the same context as the bodyweight leg extensions, where you need to remain in a completely open angle. So I don't want to spend too much time there, but these are some at-home variations and ways that you can prioritize your quad in absence of hip extension. And if total quad hypertrophy is your goal, at least in the long term, then including these movements is going to be important. If you're just at home for 3 weeks and you're waiting for your gym to open back up, I don't think it's a huge deal if you just squatted and did different kind of squat variation movements. But anyway, just kind of some food for thought in case you are kind of working at home and don't have a leg extension machine. So anyway, kick it back to you, bro.
Yeah, a couple things I wanted to add. First one was a question for people who might not have their anatomy completely down pat. The rectus femoris, can you give us kind of a low-level explanation of which muscle that is in the quad?
Yeah, so that's going to be the big one that runs from the knee up and toward the hip. On the
outside,
go ahead.
In the middle, on the inside.
I believe it's the middle.
I thought that's what I thought too, like the main one, like right on the top.
Yeah, the main one that runs through the middle. And so you'll just get a little bit more of a stimulus by being able to create knee extension in absence of hip extension there.
I agree. One thing I wanted to add that you were talking about right before we got into the single leg movements, especially with the kind of the knees going over the toes. There's like an age-old, wives' tale about it being bad for your knees, and you're going to create problems, going full range of motion. And I just wanted to provide a little personal insight there. So back in like 2016, I ruptured my patella tendon and had to have that surgically repaired, and was a big concern about like that. Am I going to be able to, like, what's the quality of it's going to be, because it bothered me for so long before that. It feels brand new, and I'm not super young anymore. I'm be turning 33 in a couple weeks, and my left knee is as good as it ever was. And I think a big proponent of that reason why is because I kind of moved away from squatting for power and force output and stuff, and moved into more hypertrophy. I'm always using as much range of motion as I can, keeping my foot flat on the ground, and then using kind of different tools like elevating my heels or something like that to help me get in that full range of motion, and always trying to get my hamstring to touch my calf on, and any kind of movement where the machine or whatever equipment I'm using will allow me that depth. And it feels great. I mean, it feels better than they had in the years leading up to when I did have that injury. So I think it's all really relative to how you recover, and the kind of loads and the quality of the loads and tension you put on your joints and muscles. So it's not like it's just it's been proven incorrect time over time, but it's one of those things that kind of refuses to die a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other thing you alluded to was just that when you squat in this manner, you don't need as much weight. And I think that was a huge factor. I know it was for me, and I think it was for you, in that it kind of took ego out of squatting for me a little bit. And hip hinges and squatting are two movements that I always have had ego kind of attached to. And by completely changing the way in which we squat and understanding that squatting this way is going to require less weight to get the stimulus that we're after, it really made that whole process of kind of transitioning to that squat style friendlier, more effective, and just, it isn't as much stress on your joints when the weight is lower. So instead of putting yourself in these positions to maximize loading, you're putting yourself in positions to maximize muscular stimulus, which in fact is going to take stress off the joints. So just to kind of reiterate that point.
Yeah, I think you tied that up perfectly. I agree 100%. Let's move into hamstrings next a little bit. So do you want to give us a little bit of an overview on this one?
Yeah, totally. So hamstrings really have two types of movements that will target them. You have your hip hinges. These are your good mornings, your stiff-legged deadlifts, your deadlifts, I guess, but we don't really deadlift a whole ton, stimulus fatigue ratio stuff. So stiff-legged deadlift, RDL variations. These can be done single leg, double leg, good mornings. And then you have your isolation hamstring movements. So you have your leg curls, and leg curls, like there's so many different variations of leg curls. You can do them seated. You can do them lying. You can do them kneeling. So they have these cool machine where you put your knee up against a pad and then your other leg is hanging off and you can curl that way. You can do them with a cable where the ankle cuff is on your leg and you're pretty much just standing against the cable machine and flexing backwards, leaving your quad stable and only flexing from the back of the knee. So a lot of different kind of variations of leg curls that you can institute into the program, but it's really simple in that your hamstring training really should just have a dedicated hip hinge movement, something for the hip hinge, and then something isolation for the leg curl. And if you have those two styles of movements in your program, you're covering all the bases that you need for hamstring development. Kind of getting into hip hinges specifically to focus on that. It's been a couple years that I've really been focusing on hip hinges, and the amount of care that I put into my technique has increased probably every month. It's like every month or two, I get to a weight and I'm like, ooh, I'm not sure that I'm performing this how I want. And I'll have to review video and go back and, really be honest with myself. And hold myself accountable to perfect movement. And then I'll lower the weight 10 or 15% and I'll refine form again. And then I'll lower it another 10 to 15% and refine form. And this isn't the way that I necessarily think that you should approach this. I think that the better way, if I would have known better, would just have been that I should have chosen a much lighter weight to begin with and held myself accountable and never increased weight until I was so happy with the movement that there was no other option but to increase weight. This is kind of how I describe progressive overload too, is that you're not forcing progression, or you shouldn't be forcing progression every week. Especially with a hip hinge, if I try to just go every week, I'm going to add 5 or 10 pounds. Eventually I'm just going to be pulling the movement with my back and my hamstrings aren't going to be doing anything. So I think that progressive overload needs to be thought of as a necessity, or else the weight is too easy. So if I started my RDLs at 275 and for 10s, and then in 1 week, maybe 5 weeks later, I was like, oh man, this 275 by 10 is just way too easy. It's not really providing me a challenge anymore. I better go add some weight to this movement. And then I stick with that weight for a while, and then that becomes too easy, and then I add weight again. So it's a more reactive way of loading movements instead of a proactive way. And I really think with all movements, you can get in trouble with proactive progressive overload, but especially with hip hinges, you can. So that's kind of been my biggest lesson with these. And, back flexion in a hip hinge, back flexion is essentially the rounding of the back. I don't do it terribly. I would say the degree of back flexion that I have when I do hip hinges is maybe 3 to 5%, and it's toward the end of the set. But I don't want any back flexion. So it's difficult for me at times because I even struggle to understand what proximity to failure is with a hip hinge. And I know this is something other people have struggled with too. So to expand on that, what I mean is that if I was deadlifting in the CrossFit days and functional fitness days, failure in a deadlift is literally the inability to lift the weight off the ground without tearing your back, or at least, excessive rounding to the point where you can feel it and you're like, ooh, that was too much. Even in a stiff-legged deadlift, it's really easy to continue feeling your hamstrings, but also feel your back. And the example of this would be like, say I'm doing a set of 8. I might have perfect flat back, neutral spine for reps 1 through 5. And then rep 6, I get like a degree of back flexion, but I'm like, ooh, I still feel my hamstrings really hard. So then the next rep, it's like 2 or 3 degrees of back flexion, but I still feel my hamstrings, and then it's like 5 degrees of flexion. And at what point is it that the back flexion is too much and suddenly you can't do it anymore? Because the truth is I could be in 5% or 5 degrees of back flexion, and then I could do another rep and be in 7 degrees, and then another rep and be in 9 degrees, and another rep and be in 12 degrees. And my back is just continually taking more of the load. My hamstrings are still taking some of the load, but the back is taking incrementally more. And I could just keep doing that. So where exactly is failure? And that's, I think, I still haven't mastered this, but I think knowledge and awareness around this is really important for me. So I film every single set of every hip hinge that I do, especially the heavy sets. And I literally sit there and I analyze my movement, and I make sure that when the bar is stopped at the ground or below my knee, that the first thing that moves is that my chest rises, that we don't see my back go like this and then my chest rise, but that we're in this position and then the chest rises, right? So anyways, those are just kind of random thoughts that I have on hip hinging, but I think they're things that everybody deals with. So anyway, I'd love your thoughts on that. And then I want to circle back and talk about leg curls.
Yeah, so I agree. And I ran through the same issues, you just covered with, kind of when ego and putting more weight on the bar was kind of the thing. Like hip hinging, especially in like an RDL, right, or a stiff-legged deadlift, is RDL's Romanian deadlift, for anyone who's not familiar. It's easy for that to happen. And so some things that I have done over time to make that a little bit different is when I don't do as much RDLs, or if I am doing them, it is, I'll do like a single leg with like my rear foot supported or something like that, which makes it much, much easier to be more hamstring or glute dominant. And then if I'm doing like a standard RDL or a stiff-legged deadlift, I'll use a snatch grip, which makes it harder in that regard. And you have to use that lighter weight. And I've really just spent time like finding the movement really, really well and figuring out, okay, this bar path is going to work best for me, my arm length, because all these things are going to be these little kind of nuanced changes that will make things either more appropriate or less appropriate given, the context of an individual and their, kind of anatomical positions. So for me, like just being able to find like, okay, if I put my feet at this angle and maybe I move my toes out a little bit, I can feel it more in like that kind of hamstring adductor area, and that's going to give me a really, really good stimulus. And just kind of playing around and searching for this position gives me really, really a good, like the best stimulus. Personally, I really like the stiff leg deadlifts because you can kind of find that position before you pull the weight off the ground. So like you can set up your tension, feel it in your hamstrings, and then go from there. And then if, I know I kind of lose my set, or I hit my technical failure when I lose it trying to pull it off the ground, right? So when I'm like, I kind of, the weight is still on the ground, I find that position, and if the first thing that happens is I lose the position as I try and lift the weight, I know that I've hit technical failure. So that is kind of my thought there. One movement that I did kind of want to bring up before we get into straight hamstring curls is the GHRs, glute ham raises. So these are something that you're going to be able to find more, obviously much more common in like a CrossFit or functional fitness style gym, and less so in like a traditional global gym. But I would say of all movements for hamstrings, these are probably my favorite. It's a very interesting combination where you do get a little bit of, you have like almost like an isometric type hip hinge position, but then you get that curl as well. They're very, very challenging, but I really, really do like them. I'm curious to your thoughts there.
Yeah, I like them too. I don't have a machine, so I've been having to modify with Nordics, which are basically the same idea, but you kind of wedge your feet underneath a barbell. For anyone that doesn't know, you have a barbell on the ground, it's loaded really heavy, you wedge your feet under, and then you kind of lower your body and lift your body from the ground. Really, really hard. I actually much prefer the GHR because I feel like you can drive your knees into the pad a little bit, and it provides a little bit of bracing, which makes the movement quite a little bit less drastic, maybe. Nordics are tough. I struggle with movements that require a ton of setup. I've realized that about myself over the last like year or two, is that if movements require like 5 or 10 minutes of setup and a bunch of like plates carrying and stuff like that, I'm like, find me something else to do, because that shit is so time consuming. But no, I love the GHR. I think the cool thing about the GHR too is that it's not an isolation leg curl movement, and it's also not a pure hip extension movement. So it's kind of got a little bit of components of both, which is pretty unique. And you'll get really, really sore from doing like 2 sets of 5.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can't do much volume. It's just that challenging of a movement.
So real quick on leg curls, there was a recent study that just came out. I think it was October 2020. It looks like Sumiyaki and colleagues, and they compared a seated leg curl to a lying leg curl, and found that the seated leg curl was more effective because it allows a stretch at the top. And this fits in line with a lot of other science that talks about, even aside from the contracted position, there is benefit to hypertrophy in the stretched position. So this is super cool, right? Like you can think about this in relation to a dumbbell fly too, is like if you do your dumbbell fly and you stop that thing shy of stretch, then you're actually missing out on potential hypertrophy stimulus. So I believe that this was why they found, or that they believe that this is why the seated leg curl was more effective than the lying leg curl. And then the last thing to touch on regarding leg curls is that you can really butcher this movement by trying to explode up to begin the contraction. If you explode too hard, it engages the calf. So the gastrocnemius, which is the big calf muscle, it is active for about the first 30% of the range of motion of a leg curl. It might be less in the seated leg curl, but I know it's about 30% of the movement for lying leg curl. And so if you dynamically explode up out of the bottom of that leg curl, your calf will contribute to the movement. So you want to be a little bit more controlled. And I've found it really helps if you flex your foot down. So foot down like this, instead of basically pointing your toes to your shin, so that you're creating a lengthened calf position before you leg curl. And then that can help take the propensity to use the calf out of the movement equation.
So just to make sure I understand it, so you're saying if you were to like point your toes down, like towards the floor, you can help your hamstring a little bit with your calf, but then if you would, let's say, pull your toes back towards your shin, that will remove the calf from the movement?
Yeah, exactly. So if you put the calf into a pre-stretched position and you don't let it flex, then it will isolate the hamstring more. Whereas if you put the calf into a flexed position, or if you allow yourself to move from stretched position to flex position mid-rep, then you're going to engage the calf.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm just kind of in my head thinking I just happen to, by nature, always have my toes kind of pulled back towards my shins whenever I'm doing hamstring curls, seated or lying. So it's interesting.
I think it's pretty intuitive if you've done it for a little while. And
I wanted to add that if you have access to like a traditional gym, right, most people are going to use I feel like it's more, historically people would use the lying hamstring curl as opposed to the seated. I had always had a preference towards the seated, and I think I just kind of maybe got lucky there, but I could just feel it so much better through like such a more full range of motion. And then something I saw, I think you posted this maybe on Instagram a week or two ago, about if you lean forward, it will even increase like the full contraction, the amount of like full contraction you can get, and it makes the movement like harder, but in a good way. And I agree. Like I just always had that propensity to lean forward in them, and it's so much better than if I was to like sit all the way back into the chair and keep my torso as upright as possible. the seated leg curls, especially if you kind of slow down the eccentric, and kind of don't let it slam back up to the extension. It is an incredible. By incredible, I mean it like in the most negative term, an incredible stimulus in your hamstrings. It feels awful when you get off.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I mean, it's terrible. I find myself grunting in the basement so much that sometimes Kim's coming down and she's like, "Are you okay? Like, what's going on?" Um, but yeah, so leaning forward, it pre-stretches the hamstring. So it's like the old sit and reach test that you would do in school where you would sit and reach your toes, right? You're leaning forward and it's pre-stretching the hamstring. So what you're allowing by leaning forward, you're allowing your hamstring to achieve a deeper and more tension producing stretch at the end range of the movement.
Let's quickly talk about calves. I know since it's a smaller muscle group, there isn't like as much detail or nuance to go into, but I think it's important to cover because we both have strong feelings about certain parts of it.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the biggest thing that I've learned and that kind of has come out in the industry in the last couple of years has just been the importance of the stretch position in a calf raise. And it makes sense intuitively. So when you think about it, we walk all day on our calves, like all day long. We're flexing our calves. We're walking on our toes, blah, blah, blah. They're extending, they're flexing, etc. The one thing that we never do in our life is actually take the calf into a contracted position from a deep stretch position. So the way that I have begun doing calf raises and prescribing calf raises is with a 2 to 3 second stretch position pause. And this isn't just a comfortable stretch. This is like literally stretch your calf as low as you possibly can at the bottom of every rep, loaded. So you can think about this by like standing on the edge of a stair with one leg and your other leg is not providing any assistance. Just take that calf with your toes on the edge of the stair, take it all the way down to as deep of a stretch as you can handle and hold it there for 2 to 3 seconds and then explode up into a contraction and hold that contraction at the top for 1 to 2 seconds. And then every single rep is about a 6-second rep because you have about 3 seconds at the bottom, exploding up, and then a 2-second pause at the top. If you can do that and hold a dumbbell in your hand, in the hand of the working leg, and then use the other hand kind of for support on like a railway or a wall or something like that. That is just absolutely wretched. And you don't need to do a ton of reps because the reps are so long. A 6-second rep, right? You do 8 reps, you're already under tension for 48 seconds. So I like the 8 to 10 rep range with those. And man, you don't need a lot of weight at all. I've found with really focusing on it, I can do a set of 10 with each leg and literally have my calves cramping up. I can also do it with weight, but much less weight than if I'm just kind of going through reps fast and, not even fast, but like, a controlled tempo without pausing at the top or the bottom. I can do a 70, 80 pound dumbbell for those with the pause at the top and the bottom. 6 to 8 quality reps with a 50-pound dumbbell in my hand is more than enough. So, yeah, that's my jam when it comes to calves. What about you?
One thing I wanted to ask about quick is like, what do you think about the like training your calves from a seated position? Like there's that, like that traditional seated calf raise machine versus like a different thing, like you said, standing off the top of a stair or somewhere where your legs are completely straight or where your knee is not bent, I guess I should say.
Yeah, I mean, you need both. So the standing one is going to train almost exclusively the gastrocnemius gastroc, which is the big muscle that runs up the calf. And you will get a little bit of soleus when you do that, which is the lower calf muscle. But when you bend the knee like a seated calf raise, you get almost exclusively soleus with a little bit of gastroc. So I think very much like the quad conversation with the importance of having isolated knee extension movements. It's similar in the calf in that you can probably get some decent calf development just doing standing calf raise variations. But if you really want, the last 2, 3, 4% development in your calves and get it all out there, you got to do a seated variation too.
Yeah, I personally really do not like anything where my knee is bent with the calf training. It just it puts me in a weird, it feels like a confined position where I'm not moving freely, right? And I think one of those things, like calves are one of those things, like a lot of people don't even train them to begin with. And I think you just kind of have to kind of draw
Hmm.
your line in the sand and see if you really want that extra 3%. Like if you're not competing or something like that, my take is if I don't like it, if it puts me in a weird position where I don't feel like completely safe, or it feels like a really natural type of thing, I'm not going to do it. But with everyone, that's going to you're the only one who's going to be able to make that decision for yourself. But I really like your
Try the seated one single leg, because I think it does kind of put you in an awkward position when you have both legs like crammed in there and that pad is on top of your legs. But if you can kind of turn your body to a more comfortable position and do them single
That's an
leg, you might
interesting
find
perspective.
that
I've
that
never
works a
tried
little
that.
better for you.
Cool. Moving into upper body. Start with everyone's favorite, but being completely honest, it is far from my favorite. I don't think it's your favorite either, but by far the most trained, chest.
Yeah, so it's funny because chest used to be like my absolute favorite growing up. I mean, it was everything, right? Like I don't know why. Like, it made the man, so to speak. Like in the muscle magazines and stuff, they'd always talk about how your chest walks through the room before you
I
do, and
think
like
I
all,
think it's like the
you got some
quintessential
thoughts on it? Yeah.
teenage boy, coming into manhood type thing because it was the same exact thing for me. I remember like freshman year when they like made us all start lifting after football, and there was like the first set of kids who could like bench 135, which is like the full plate, the 45-pound plate, which are like the linemen and stuff.
Hmm.
And then I remember like it deeply bothered me that it took me longer to bench 135. And then obviously as you get stronger, that same thing happens with 225. And 225 is like the test, right? Of, like when you're like 15 or whatever, of you're like strong. And it really really bothered me that I couldn't do it for so long. But now I'm like, now I train chest just because I don't want to neglect things, but it's like I don't really enjoy it.
Well,
And I
you have a good
think
chest
that's
genetically. You
part of
don't
it
really
as
have to
well.
do
Like
too much with
there's
it.
my priority could be spent,
Yeah.
or my time and volume and recovery capacity could be spent in other areas.
Yeah. Well, I can definitely say growing up that I was really bad at barbell benching. I have a theory that whatever you did and prioritized when you were, going through puberty and your first few years of training kind of stick with you. We've talked about this before. But I couldn't barbell bench much when I first started. I was 15 and I was also slow in puberty, so I didn't have a lot of upper body development. And I didn't like that I couldn't bench, a 45-pound plate on either side. So, and my fragile ego at 15, I just decided to get really strong at dumbbells. And, it's funny because 23 years later, and I still really don't like barbell benching. I did it for about 2 years in college, never really liked it, but did it because all the bros were, and then did it for a year, really kind of dedicated during the CrossFit days. But other than those 3 years in the 23 years of training, I haven't done any barbell benching, all dumbbells. So, one thing I will say about chest is that it was the easiest one for me to build a mind muscle connection with. And it may be because that was the first one that I really put priority in when I was beginning training, that it was the muscle that I wanted. And so I spent a lot of time and energy into thinking about it and envisioning it. And visualization, I think, is important when it comes to mind muscle connection. And I spent time doing that. But with all of that said, it really was only in the last couple years that I even learned how to press prioritizing my chest. It's easy to prioritize your chest when you're doing a fly or a cable crossover or something like that, because that is the primary mover. And when you think about what the pec does, the pec abducts, right? So it takes the arms out here and it brings them together. It doesn't as much contribute to pressing, which is more a delt and tricep dominant movement. So to learn how to prioritize your chest when you're pressing in a sequence in which the triceps and the front delts want to take over, how can we then find ways to change the way we're pressing through the bar or the dumbbells in such a manner that the chest becomes the primary mover? So when we're looking at dumbbells, which are, my preference, the thing that has helped me recently has been gripping the dumbbell on the inside. So we have the dumbbell, the natural propensity is to grip it in the middle. If you move your hand into the center of the dumbbell to the thumb side, then as you drive out of the bottom, that part of the hand is going to be elevated and the tricep, the pinky side, is going to be depressed. And so you're going to be calling the chest into action more as you're pressing those weights. So it's quite subtle, but that's one of the kind of tips and tricks that I've been using recently with my dumbbell pressing. And it's definitely helped me get a better connection with the chest than I had prior. Another thing that I think is super important, and I do this with all pressing movements now, is pausing at the bottom. Pausing at the bottom is a cool thing, especially with quads too. We didn't really cover that, but like the thing with pausing at the bottom is that it forces you to control your descent. If you don't pause at the bottom, then your natural inclination is to use the stretch reflex and come back up. But when you're using that, you're just using the stretch reflex. You're not actually using the muscle itself. So by lowering down, I'm actively thinking about, in the same way we were with the quads, we're actively thinking about feeling the chest load with tension into a deep stretch position at the bottom, pausing, engaging, and then being able to manifest power through the chest muscles. The pause allows you to almost gather yourself, to mentally connect with the areas that you want to use during the ascent. So I think both gripping the dumbbells on the inside, pressing through the thumb side, and then also making sure that you're pushing through or pausing at the bottom and then engaging with purpose in each press is going to be a vital component.
You know, everything you just said. The one thing I thought was really, really interesting about what got priority when you were younger, and then just like the kind of mind muscle connection. And I kind of had this thought as you were talking about it, like maybe there has to do something with like the duration of that connection and how long it's been there, something like that. Because I agree, like same way I can do one set of chest and completely blow it up. Like I have an incredible pump, like there's so much blood in there because I just have such a good connection with it. But for other muscles, like, I mean, it's a challenge, but the chest, it's so easy. And it's strange because it's like, I don't like doing it because I kind of, like we talked about, just don't really need it in terms of comparatively to everything else. One thing I will say, I personally, if I am going to do chest, it's almost always going to be an incline version. It feels much safer on my shoulders. It just feels like a much more intuitive pressing motion for me. It could be because I have very, very long arms, so that kind of makes it just a little bit safer in that regard, where I'm in a little bit different of a position. I'm bringing it higher on, towards my, like about nipple height, a little bit higher than nipple height. And it just feels much better for me. And agree, I always pause everything because it just allows me to connect and think about driving with that off of that bottom position as opposed to just using that stretch reflex. So yeah, I agree with everything you said on chest.
I don't really like flat pressing in general either. I tend to do most of my flies or fly press movements flat. Because I think naturally the way that the arm moves, it comes back a little bit. So you end up getting a bit more upper chest just from the nature of that movement pattern. But there was a study relatively recently, I think they covered it in Mass in the last month or two, where they compared flat bench only, incline bench only, or flat and incline bench. And I want to say that flat bench only underperformed the other two, and that the other two sequences of incline plus flat or incline by itself were somewhat similar as far as total pec development, but that the incline plus flat
I
had
remember
a
seeing
slight
that.
advantage.
I remember seeing a post about it, and that's what I remember as well. Like the flat only actually performed the worst, which was interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
Let's talk about back. I think this is going to be a good one, specifically because both you and I love training back, and it's a little bit uncommon for that as much, to be a favorite body part, probably because you can't see it. But for me, it's just always been so much fun. Like if I ever was having a terrible gym day, I can always just hit back and it's just good. I never have any bad back days. So let's have you kind of kick it off, take us through some of the movement patterns, difference with horizontal versus vertical pulling, and then we'll just talk about it.
Yeah, cool. So the big thing with back, and first off, actually, I love back too. Let's just put that out there real quick. Back is awesome. And I think it's also one of both, for both of us, it's one of our better body parts. And I think that we both also agree that the back can handle a lot of volume. And I think that part of the reason that the back can handle so much volume is that there's so many different parts to it. So to say that you're just training back, you're like, okay, is it upper back? Is it lats? Is it mid back? Is it erectors, like rear delts? I mean, they're all lower traps. They're all kind of part of the back. So the key to what part of your back you're actually training is what the elbows are doing. And this is really the biggest piece of knowledge that I think I could pass on to anybody. And when I tell some people, they're just like, oh my God, like I never knew this, but you know, in theory, it makes sense. So one of the things I always get are people sending me row videos for form critique. And they're like, how is this? Is this right? And what I often find myself saying is that there almost isn't like a bad way to row. I mean, there's bad form when you're rowing, but how you're rowing really depends what part of your back you're actually targeting. So simply looking at like a bent over dumbbell row, you can row, let's call it 3 different ways. There's probably more, but you could row up into your upper chest and your elbows are going to come out like a T. And if your elbows come out like a T, we're essentially prioritizing 100% of the rear delts, traps, rhomboids type area. There is literally no lat involvement. So as soon as your elbows turn out, the lats turn off. If you wanted to row and recruit the lats, then you row with your elbows coming back toward the waistline. You keep those elbows in nice and tight, and the finish of the movement has that dumbbell almost by your hip. So instead of coming out like a T, where that dumbbell is going to be up by your shoulder at the top, we're going to turn that arm down so that the elbow comes into the hip, as does the dumbbell that follows that line of pull. So both ways are great examples of rowing. They're just for a different purpose. When we talk about the lats, it gets even more complicated because I mentioned how you can row that dumbbell into your hip and you'll get some lat involvement. That's true. You will. You'll also still get some of the upper back involvement that you get when you turn your elbow out into a T. However, the lat turns off even when you row into the hip if your elbow passes your midline. So as soon as you begin rowing and your elbow passes what would be your torso, now we're moving into scap retraction and your lat is no longer working. So this is all very like interesting and nuanced, but the elbow movement determines what you're working. And this applies to vertical pulls or horizontal pulls. Think about a vertical pull. Like say you're doing a pull down and you're doing a standard wide grip pull down. So the bar is up over your head, you're fully extended, and then you lean back and you pull the bar wide down into your chest. If you look from a side angle at this movement, your elbows are going way past your torso at the bottom of that movement. So at the contracted position, your lats are not really working. You might be getting a little bit of that upper lat kind of right under the armpit area, but your iliac lat, that's the lower portion, that's not going to be working at all. But we can bias the pull down movement for more lower lat involvement by essentially starting the movement in front of the body. So instead of starting the movement over the body, we're going to shift that. Let me see if you can see this. If you turn, if you're watching on YouTube, you can start the movement like this instead of like this. And when we start out front, we stay in the active range of what is the lat. And then when we pull that movement down, the finish position is going to be right about here. So if you can see, my elbow has not passed my torso. So I know it's kind of weird trying to demo this stuff on YouTube, but general idea being that if you pull and your elbow doesn't pass your torso and you drive the elbow down toward your waistline as you're pulling instead of back, then we can prioritize more of that iliac lat, which is really the part of the lat that helps make you look really wide, right? Like if you're doing a lat spread and you have really big like upper lats, that's cool, but you want that really big wide bottom lat, which really helps to make the waist look a little bit smaller and provide that contrast. So that's kind of your basic introduction into the way that elbow movement impacts stimulus.
Yeah, one thing I
And
will
yeah,
say
let's
is
hear what you have to say on it.
we'll put a YouTube video in the show notes about everything you just talked about elbow position in the lat and stuff like that to help anyone who's a little bit lost or didn't quite pick up on it. I know obviously explaining biomechanics over audio can be difficult, so we'll do that. And I agree. I think especially with the lat. So I was always someone like I loved doing pull-ups, right? But I would, here you have to go all the way down and like let your arms completely hang and your shoulders, retract or detract, I guess I should say, and then depress exactly.
Depress, yeah.
And then, maybe last year I started doing my pull-ups. I would do like assisted pull-ups with like a band or even that assisted machine. And I would only stay in that active range with my pull-ups. And it's been a game changer because you're just like taking that movement and you're just like condensing the quality of the movement to just the part of the movement you're looking to get, which is like that lat contraction. And now I can do like 2 sets of pull-ups and like my lats are already blown up. So I can just like really, really laser focus the stimulus I'm providing to exactly where I want it. And then when I want to train, like my upper back or something like that, I'm going to do like more of like a rowing position, which I'll row a little bit higher, not towards like the hip. I would say my favorite movement there is just like either like a replication of a Penlay row, or like a full slow barbell row in the Smith machine. I like the one that's that's vertical and doesn't have that angle, in it. And I can kind of like pull back a little bit, if I'm putting my palms behind me and pull back a little bit, and then can get a really good stimulus in that regard. And it's just perfect for what I'm looking for. So those are two movements that I really like there.
Yeah, totally. I think with back training in general, people often use too much weight, and what happens when the weight is too heavy is the upper back just takes over because it's stronger. When you're isolating the lat or trying to isolate the lat, like you alluded to with the assisted pull-up machine, like you can do 20 pull-ups. Absolutely, you can do 20 pull-ups, or you can do 20 assisted pull-ups and just wreck your lats. And people might think like, why would you do an assisted pull-up if you can do 20 pull-ups in a row? You can do 100-pound weighted pull-ups. Why are you doing assisted pull-ups? Because it allows you to focus more on that muscle. And when you're not burdened by load, you can actually connect with the lat. And it's like the hardest thing to connect with, right? Like people have been training 20 years and still have shitty mind muscle connection with their lat. So being able to reduce the load and understand kind of the movement of the lat, and then maybe even begin to institute some of these practices where you perform a movement where the elbow doesn't pass the midline, then I think that this really is going to help people to understand that mind muscle connection and get more out of their back training in general.
Let's move into shoulders. So shoulders are a really, really interesting one, especially because people injure them so frequently. I know both you and I have gone through that. So let's just talk me through a little bit of like your kind of favorite movement patterns here with shoulders.
Yeah, recently cables have just been so important for me. The the dumbbells, they especially okay. Back up and talk about how we're talking. This is primarily a lateral raise conversation, and maybe provide context to why that is here. Overhead pressing is going to work almost entirely front delts, which you're going to also hit through incline pressing and flat pressing and all the different presses that you do. So in physique sport, we don't do a ton of front delt work. We also don't really find the overhead press to be super advantageous in stimulus to fatigue ratio, which we touched on in the beginning of this episode. So, you get a lot of load on your shoulders, but your triceps tend to take over when you're doing an overhead press movement. And there was actually a study about this that that found that the triceps were more active in an overhead press even than the shoulders. So, people do overhead tricep extensions as like, it's basically a narrow grip overhead press is a tricep extension, because it is a tricep movement more than it is a shoulder movement. So when we start talking about, targeting the delts, we're talking about the lateral delts, the medial head. And so for that purpose specifically, I find cables to just be so much more effective. The main reason being that there is tension at all portions of the movement. So when we're doing a dumbbell lateral raise, you get to the bottom 30% of the rep and the dumbbells are just hanging there. They're not actually providing tension on your lateral delt. But when you set yourself up into a variety of different cable-based lateral raise setups, whether you're prone, standing, one arm, maybe with a cuff on, different varieties of cable lateral raises here, you can actually get to the bottom of your movement and you'll still have a stretch, a literal tight tension on that lateral delt, so that you can feel a lot of the same things we were discussing when it comes to the quads, or how you want to feel that thing stretch as you descend down into the hole. Same idea here with the lateral raise, where we really want to feel that stretch and then the contract and keep that tension in through the full range of motion. So I'm a huge fan of that. I briefly mentioned prone, and I know this is something you wanted to discuss here too. But I think prone is going to be when you're face down on a incline or vertical barrier to keep you from being able to use momentum forward. Some people actually tend to cheat the movement by momentum backwards, which I see a lot too. So instead of people coming forward at the hip and then coming backwards, they'll just come backwards. And that's a form of momentum too. So I think you need to bias the way that you're using support for how you tend to cheat the movement. For me, I really like the prone, just like you do, where I'm face down on an incline bench or a steep bench. But other people might find that more beneficial to put their back against the bench and keep their torso open towards the cable. So just kind of different variations for different people. But I think that finding a way to standardize your lateral raise movement and making sure that you're not just increasing reps because you're increasing momentum is huge. And I realized over the years that even when I thought I wasn't using momentum and that I was standardizing reps, lateral raises are so nuanced and specific that even just taking a big breath at the bottom of a rep, like, and then going into your rep, like even that is a form of momentum, even if you don't actually really think that you're using your torso or your hips for momentum. Just changing the way in which you brace for the movement can create an ability for you to get 2 or 3 additional reps. So it's very subtle, but you really do need to hold yourself super accountable with these movements and understand that you're not going to progress in these like you do with other movements. You know, you and I have both been between 25 and 35 pound dumbbells for lateral raises for fucking a decade. So, I don't know that I ever expect to increase the weight that I'm using for my lateral raises as much as just becoming better at connecting with my lateral delts and create more effective movement patterns.
The lateral raises are one of those things where for like the first 10 years of my lifting career, I just couldn't do them well enough to provide a stimulus. So I didn't like to do them. And I think it's one of those things where it's going to be a little bit different for everyone. You have to find that positioning or that movement path where your arm feels comfortable and you can actually feel that tension in there. In the prone, I really, really, really like, because it it stops you from kind of arching your chest or doing these different things once it gets difficult, because it restricts your movement to just that plane of motion, which is really, really nice. Something else that took me a really long time to figure out is when you're squeezing the dumbbells really tight or whatever you're using, maybe it's a cable handle, it kind of changes how, because you're the grip really will kind of mask the feeling on you a little bit. So what I really like is either using something like Versa grips, or if I don't have them, just holding the dumbbell really loosely, or kind of using the bottom of my palm against the dumbbell as well, so that I'm kind of allowing them just to hang in my grip and then just lifting from the top as opposed to squeezing and swinging. So just dangle and lift, or kind of a little bit of a false grip. And that way, it just changes the stimulus so much. But yeah, one of those lateral raises are one of those things that those are a physique changing movement, because it makes your shoulders more broad and wide. So if you're, interested in physique, and, that is something that it's kind of a must do.
I think I was on mute. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. When you're doing lateral raises, you really want to avoid the wrist being back like this, because now you're engaging forearm and bicep into the movement. So if you can maintain not necessarily like a false grip, right, but like that finger grip you were talking about, but more just keeping your wrist curved over, then now we're taking the forearm out of the movement and we're able to use the lateral delt much more effectively. Perfect. So that was a really good point.
Explanation than I could do. Moving into triceps. Triceps are really interesting because it's like, it's the bulk of your arm, right? So as much as everyone loves training biceps, like I feel like if your goal is bigger arms, triceps are going to provide you more headway on your goal in a shorter time because their propensity to grow is just more, I would say. So let's take us through some of like the kind of movement patterns for triceps, whether you need to keep your elbows completely in or out, and some of your favorite movements for doing this.
Totally, yeah. So people are obsessed with the long head. It's like every person is like, oh, I got to do this because it prioritizes the long head or whatever. So the long head is the long head because it is the long head. It's the bulk of your arm, right? So it makes sense that people want to train it. Unfortunately, there are also two other heads that need work. So what you should consider is that the overhead position for the triceps, generally seated, not lying, but seated overhead position, is going to provide the most tension and stretch into your long head. So when we're doing movements like that, we want to feel a deep stretch come down at the bottom of the movement. And then from that deep stretch position, as it's loaded, we come back up into the contracted position. One really solid movement for this that I alluded to during the shoulder discussion was the narrow grip overhead press. So I think this is better done from behind the head as far as tricep prioritization goes, but you could probably do it from the front too. You just take a narrow grip overhead press, and that's literally the movement that you're doing, whether it's behind the head or in front of the head. It does not matter if your elbows flare. One of the big things that cause elbow pain is this desire to constantly pull your elbows in, right? You're putting them into this awkward position that they don't want to naturally be in. But if your elbows flare out, who cares? Your tricep is still extending the arm. So for me, that was a big thing that I discovered this year, is that I'm just going to let my elbows go out into their natural position instead of trying to force them back in. And my elbows feel so much better just by doing that. So long head movements are overhead with a deep stretch at the bottom. The best tricep movement that I found this year has been different variations of easy bar or barbell movement, where instead of doing a skull crusher to the skull or behind the head, we're actually going to take that thing into about the chin level or the mouth or the nose, somewhere in that region. And what we want to try and accomplish here is similar in theory to what we want to try and accomplish with the way that we stretch the quad at the bottom of a squat. So as you squat down and that knee drives forward over the toe, that stretch occurs deep into the quad. When we're doing one of these tricep movements where we're going to bring this bar in toward the mouth, the nose, or the chin, the elbows are simultaneously shooting down toward your hip. So when you get to the bottom of that movement, you'll feel this immense stretch in your tricep. This isn't going to be a stretch that you feel in the long head. The long head's what you're going to feel when you're overhead, right? But this movement is going to hit the other two heads of the tricep here. So I highly encourage you to give that a try if you haven't before. It's kind of like a JM press. I think JM press actually goes into the neck or chin level. This is just somewhere in that region that feels comfortable with really just a purposeful stretch position at the bottom. I would pause at the bottom, drive your elbow down, feel that stretch, and then push back up. And when you press back up, it's almost like a hybrid of like a skull crusher with a close grip bench press, just because of the where the bar is located on your body. So think about that. You don't have to just try and do like a tricep extension type movement like this. You actually want to actively press through the triceps as well, like you would through a close grip bench. So yeah, that's one. And then the other thing is the use of cables for something like a kickback. And a kickback is like the worst movement ever with a dumbbell. Same reasons I dislike it for lateral raises, in that there's no tension at the bottom. The kickback might even be worse, because for the bottom 60% of the movement there's like no tension. You only get tension very much at the top of the kickback, right? But if you set up in a cable machine and you have enough, you set back far enough so that there's tension, you can literally get tension on that tricep through the 100% of the range of motion. And at the bottom position, instead of no tension, it's like the most tension. Huge stretch position. So the kickback definitely has utility, but let's save
Yeah,
that for cables.
I agree with, especially, so for me particularly with, I love using cables for my triceps, but not like your kind of what everyone will use when you see, like, not like your traditional like press down with like the straight bar, the V handle. I like to do them more either single arm or with two cables, where I can kind of grip it with the bottom under my palm. And what I kind of try and do is find my natural progression of where my elbow and shoulder sit comfortably, and then I align the cable to that natural kind of movement pattern, so that I'm not like kind of trying to force my elbow in, trying to force it out, or putting my shoulder in a weird position, but I'll kind of like get in a position where I can kind of lock my shoulder in a comfortable neutral position, and then I just extend that elbow, and then make sure that at the top of the position I have tension in the cable. At the bottom, obviously, you have an enormous amount of tension, but that I really, really like, because you can just load it through that full range of motion. I would say this one is probably one of those very few times where I don't want to say disagree, but I think with the tricep especially, so much of it has to do with like your shoulder health and kind of your anatomical positions. I would say probably my favorite tricep movement is a lying cable tricep extension, similar to, like, if you were to Google like the Mark Ripito version of this. He recommends like bringing it behind your, not necessarily behind your head, but like to the forehead a little bit, and then trying to like, kind of throw it towards the ceiling. And what happens there is I get a big stretch, kind of like at the very, very top of my tricep, almost like, where it kind of meets my back. And it's really, really safe and easy on my elbow joint, but I kind of get that full stretch through like the upper portion as well, and that will really, really blow my triceps up. But I think, again, that's going to come down to a little bit of individual kind of anatomical positions, shoulder health, and flexibility at end range. But agree with finding things that you can move through a full range of motion, lower, like making sure that it's very, very easy on your joints, and you're setting your joints up in their natural progression and pathway, is going to make sure that you can, train them effectively and safely, and not kind of shred your elbows trying to put them in a weird position just because it says to keep them in strict or something like that.
Yeah, totally. I think that, this is just a general statement of training, but any movement that makes you have to think mid rep about whether your joints are hurting or whether the proper muscle is receiving the stimulus, or anything that's distracting, that's probably just not a good movement for you. So, try and avoid movements that don't allow you to connect optimally with that muscle, and just avoid distractions in movement as
I
much as
agree.
possible.
All right, last body part, and biceps, right? So every young boy or person in the gym who's lifting, right? Everyone's always hitting biceps, which is always very interesting. So just take me through, I guess, your favorite movements here, and what the most important things are for growing biceps.
Yeah, totally. So for curls, I think the biggest important thing is achieving a stretch position at the bottom, and then making sure that the bicep is doing the work to contract. So a lot of times we see, and we actually know that the shoulder extension does contribute to bicep activation. So there are people that will do a curl specifically bringing the elbows up because there is additional bicep activation there. I really don't like that. I think that my natural inclination is for my shoulder to take over. So I try to pin my elbows more behind my body. And that has been a huge thing for me. Like you mentioned, it's kind of similar to like a drag curl. But I don't want elbow travel forward. And it's not just because I don't feel as much bicep engagement, but it's because it becomes difficult for me to standardize movement week to week. If I'm allowing my elbows to come off of whatever thing I have them secured on behind me, tactilely, um, then I don't know that every week that I'm actually getting stronger in my biceps. So I like that consistency. I like that accountability. I like being able to feel a deep stretch at the bottom, like kind of seems to be a trend here. We like our stretches at the bottom of movements. Beyond that, I will say that there was a study by Chris Barakat and colleagues that came out, I want to say a year or two ago, maybe 3. But they compared 3 sets of, so there's 3 different positions that you need to consider regarding elbow angle. So there's elbows in front of the body. So that would be like a spider curl or a preacher curl or something like that. There's elbows behind the body, which would be like an incline curl or a Bayesian curl, where you're kind of standing facing away from the cable machine. And then there's elbows neutral, which would be like a standard barbell dumbbell curl standing, right? They did this study with Barakat where they did 9 sets of biceps. They did 3 in each of the 3 different elbow positions in one group. And then the other group just did 9 sets of neutral, where you're just doing a standing curl. And they found significantly more bicep hypertrophy in the group that hit it from all 3 different angles. So I think that this is relevant in that, most people that do curls, they don't just do one type of curl, but if you are just doing one type of curl, maybe you want to consider adding in the other types of curl as well, having a elbows in front of the body, elbows neutral, and elbows behind body curl movement. My favorite one is my favorite cable one is that Bayesian curl that I mentioned. So you essentially are going to stand with your back to the cable machine and let the cable pull your arm back so that your arm is probably 6 to 12 inches behind your body at the start of the rep. So you're feeling a pull and a tension in your bicep before you even begin the rep, and then pull up, contract, and feel that eccentric length in the bicep as it descends back down. And so yeah, that's my favorite bicep movement. Again, I like cables a lot for these movements, but I think that more than other movements, more than like delts or triceps, I do see a lot of utility in using free weights for biceps as well.
I really agree with finding the different position, changing the movement to a very large degree. The few things that I will add that I always try and do whenever I'm doing any biceps are full stretch in the bottom position. Like you said, it's a very reoccurring theme for us. Focus on supination. So I don't really like things where my wrist goes like neutral, where my palms will face each other at the bottom. I'm always trying to keep my palms up, which keeps the most tension on that muscle. And then trying to keep a really good force contact with like the pinky side of the palm, which helps with like kind of trying to drive supination a little bit more, which helps just contract harder. So that do that, I can use like significantly less weight, get, orders of magnitude more stimulus out of it, and don't have to do nearly as much volume to get that. And it just keeps my elbows happy, right? And then I'm not trying to I'm not swinging anything because I'm always either like supporting my back or something like that, like with the incline curls or the spider curls in a prone position. So just taking, putting myself in a little bit of a confine so that I can't cheat myself with those reps. And I find that's really, really beneficial for myself.
Yeah, great point on keeping the palm open. I should have mentioned that because I 100% agree with that. I don't like it all when the hand turns. If you're coming down supinated and then it turns into like a hammer grip at the bottom and then rotates back up again, I feel like it throws off my connection with my bicep, and it kind of makes me want to almost incorporate some forearm into the movement, a little more of the brachialis, maybe like a hammer curl. So I definitely agree that keeping the palm open allows you to stay more connected with that muscle and feel that deeper stretch at the bottom.
So, that was really cool. We just went through basically all the major muscle groups of the body, talk about our, planes of motion, things in considerations to take into, when you're training, and then a little bit of few specific exercise selection as well. So it was a really cool episode, and thanks for tuning in, guys. Thank you so much for listening to Eat, Train, Prosper. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe or share us with your friends. You can find more from Aaron at strakernutritionco.com and more from Bryan at evolvedtrainingsystems.com. Talk to you guys next time.